I don't even know how to start this. Hi everybody, what is up? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, welcome. My name is Victoria. I'm a 23-year-old woman of transgender experience, and I make mostly LGBT content here on YouTube. Now, I do normally have much more fun, upbeat videos, but unfortunately, today will not be one of those videos. In addition to making content on YouTube, I am also an alum from the University of Rhode Island. Now, I no longer live in this area anymore, but I did attend and I graduated in May of 2020. During my time at URI, I took multiple gender and women's studies courses, most of which I enjoyed to the fullest. Now, unfortunately, there was one class that I took with a certain professor that I felt very uncomfortable in. I always felt like I was an outcast in the room full of other women just like me, even some men, and I felt like the one standing out. A few days ago, I received a text message from my sister who also took multiple gender and women's studies courses. From here on forward, I will say GWS courses at URI. And she sent me a link to an article written by that exact professor that I seemed to feel very uncomfortable around. This article was titled "Fantasy Worlds in the Political Right and Left, QAnon and Transsex Beliefs." This was posted on January 28th, 2021 by Donna Hughes. So Donna Hughes, PhD, is a professor and holds the Eleanor M. and Oscar M. Carlson Endowed Chair in Women's Studies. Currently, she serves as the Director of Graduate Studies in the Gender and Women's Studies program. These titles are important to keep in mind as we explore the article that she very proudly posted. If you are interested in reading the full article, I will link it in the description box down below. I very much urge you to go and read it and see this firsthand. I am going to give you some quotes and the general overall message of her article. So first off, let me tell you what I'm not here to do. I am not here to justify my validity as a woman. I am not here to change anybody's mind. And I'm also not here to have a public discord with Donna Hughes on this, because at the end of the day, the only person who can validate me as a woman is myself, and I know myself to be a woman, and at the end of the day, nobody's opinions or anyone's article is going to change that. What I am here to do is I am here to put a stop to the spread of misinformation and hate around transgender people. I'm here to create a safer and more comfortable space for queer students, not only in the University of Rhode Island, but in schools all over the country and all over the world. So if you are here to join me in that journey, please stay tuned and let's dive into her article. So the tagline of this article starts off with, quote, "The American political left is increasingly diving headfirst into their own world of lies and fantasy, and unlike in the imaginary world of QAnon, real children are becoming actual victims." So right off the bat, you see where my issue lies. So she starts off the article by talking about the COVID-19 global pandemic. She uses this to introduce that she believes in science. Although she can't see the virus, she knows that it's around her. She says that she sees people believing, quote, "wild ideas that go against facts and reality," and that there's been a war declared on truth. And to introduce transgender people, she talks about QAnon. For those of you who might not know, QAnon is a disproven conspiracy theory from the far right that claim that there is a group, a league of Satan-worshipping, cannibalistic, pedophile child sex traffickers that consist of a lot of people on the left and people in power and all that. So this was a conspiracy theory that was based out of nothing and was used to the advantage of Donald Trump and used by extremists. This was a complete paper tiger, right? So this was a false claim that was set up to tackle down to make Donald Trump look like he was taking down some underground operation when truthfully it was completely fabricated. She says, and I quote, "Rationality and sanity are gone and have been replaced by dogmatic fantasies, political and social agendas, anger and hate." Now, remember, she's using this conspiracy theory as a base, as a mirror reflection of who trans people are. And I don't know about all of you, but I personally love myself. I love the people around me. I try to meet everybody with kindness and peace and love. The FBI now classifies QAnon conspiracies as being domestic violent extremists, as they should. And she goes on to discuss the events at the Capitol, the storming of the Capitol, all the events that took place there. And this violent attack was nothing short of terrorism. I 100% agree with her on that. She says that all of these actions and reactions were coming from, quote, fantasy beliefs and political radicalization, end quote, which is absolutely true, but I don't love where this is going in relation to trans people. As predicted, she swings it right on over to the trans community. She says that while the left is denouncing these harmful, horrible conspiracies, the left is also reproducing and creating a more problematic conspiracy, being transgender people. This is where she writes the tagline about supporting trans people being equally as bad, if not worse, than the QAnon conspiracies because, quote, real children are becoming real victims. This leads her to discuss the women's rights movement and how the question of what it means to be a woman gets brought up. So for years and years and years, centuries even, women have been shoved into a box and told that women have to be one specific way, look a certain way, behave a certain way. And if you don't do those things, if you lack in those departments, then you are no longer a woman. And what they did was they broadened these horizons, right? So women now can wear what we want. We can dress how we want, look, act, have a job, these vote, these wonderful, wonderful things where you don't have to look a certain way to be a woman, right? We can have both masculine and feminine energies, and that does not change your outer sex or your gender or anything else. You can cut your hair, you can grow your hair out, you can wear different colors, different clothes, go have different jobs, act differently. And that doesn't take away from your identity as a woman or as a man. And this does not change their gender, right? Because that is on the inside, that does not change their physical sex, that is deeper than superficiality. As these concepts were deconstructed, she says there was a movement, mostly from the queer community, to reestablish these roles. And I don't know that I agree, because nowadays we see so many people that are cisgender, that express themselves in androgyny, have different jobs. We see stay-at-home fathers and mother CEOs. We see people not forcing their children to play with trucks or dolls. Immediately, she is only focused on trans women and how she feels that we are invading female spaces and how transgender surgeries are destroying, in her words, the bodies of people assigned female at birth. She writes, and I quote, "The biological category of sex, particularly women's sex, is being smashed. Women and girls are expected to give up their places of privacy, such as restrooms, locker rooms, and even prison cells. When biological males identify as trans women, they can compete in women and girls' sports." Now, even looking at this makes my stomach flip. I feel like this concept is talked about so much, and it's the focus of so many people with, for lack of a better word, an old school way of thinking. Now, look at me. I have existed as this person since I was about 13, 14. I've looked the same. Now, are you truthfully telling me that you would rather I walk into a men's restroom, you feel that I would be safe there, and you would rather have a large, hairy, tattooed beard trans man walk in next to your daughter? Sports we can talk about in a whole other video. Now, of course, there are differences with development and puberty. People start hormones at different times. I feel like, with school sports and whatever, if you're a child, let them just be a kid and play with their friends. On a professional level, I honestly, truthfully don't know enough to speak on the matter. So let me read you what follows. And I quote, "The dystopian transsex gender identity world claims that female mammalian characteristics should be redefined and disappeared from the female body to satisfy the feelings of biological males who identify as women. Basic biological words such as breast and vagina are replaced by misogynistic transsex, transgender language so that a female has a front hole instead of a vagina." I've never heard that one. Females chest feed instead of breastfeed. All references to women disappear into terms such as people who menstruate, people with uteruses, a pregnant person, or a birthing parent. No such changes in terms are proposed for men's bodies and anatomy. These redefinitions are hatred targeted at women's bodies and their rights. This is just outright incorrect. So first of all, I mean, yes, there is a push to neutralize the gender of language in some settings. So, you might say people who menstruate if you're talking about generally periods. She is so focused on biological men, as she puts it, forcing people to speak differently for them. All of the changes that she listed were made for trans men, to make trans men, or as she views them, biological women, people assigned female at birth, to make them feel more comfortable. Designed by them for them. She says that no such changes have been made for male anatomy, which is completely untrue. I mean, I myself see posts all the time talking about people with periods or whatever, and she doesn't list them. It honestly makes me sad to read this because there's so much pain and hate in her words. She's actively trying to pick a fight. Saying that all these alterations to the gender binary and to language are just hatred for women's bodies and their rights. This isn't about you. I hate to say it, but it isn't about you. When people are changing their language and the way that they interact with gender, it's to make them feel more comfortable. It's to make their loved ones feel more comfortable. This has nothing to do with you and hatred for your body. She says that the normalization of transition and of trans people is advocating, in her words, to push children who feel like outcasts or feel different to change their bodies and to transition. And this is utterly untrue. This narrative upsets me so much because nobody is pressuring a child to transition. Yes, there probably are some parents out there who their child is sad, or they might be a little bit feminine or masculine, and they, just shove their child into gender therapy and stuff, and then the child eventually realizes that they're not trans and wasted all that time. But that is a bad parenting issue. That is not a matter of transgender issues. Hughes writes, and I quote, "Young people are guided into hormonal and surgical horrors that desex them. There are treatments and surgical procedures on women and girls, beginning with puberty-blocking hormones or testosterone administration, that can progress to double mastectomies, euphemistically called top surgeries, and hysterectomies, euphemistically called bottom surgeries. Females' bodies are permanently scarred and destroyed." Permanently scarred and destroyed. What a terrible thing to say to somebody that feels for the first time in their life that they are living their best life, that feels relief and happiness and freedom. What a harmful and honestly so close-minded, offensive thing to say to somebody, even if you don't agree with it. To look at someone who is finally feeling happy and free, to look them up and down and say, "You're permanently scarred and destroyed," it's just so hateful. She keeps referring to trans surgeries as being experimental and, horrible, that as if we're guinea pigs pioneering the medical frontier. These procedures have been in existence for years and decades, and just like any other surgery, continue to improve with every year that medical science improves. But to say, and I'll quote here, for both women and men, the bottom surgeries are experimental and extremely disfiguring. Speak for yourself, because I have had multiple procedures and I myself am not disfigured whatsoever. I love my body, I love my vulva, I love my beautiful female body, and no one is going to tell me otherwise. This is where, in my opinion, it gets completely absurd and out of line. Hughes writes, and I quote, "The sterilization of physically healthy individuals who fail to conform to society's standards mirrors the forced sterilizations of people during the eugenics movement of the 1920s and 1930s. People who were identified as not fit to reproduce were forcibly sterilized. Tens of thousands of these sterilizations took place in the United States after the 1920 U.S. Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, decided they were legal. For decades in the U.S., there have been illegal sterilization of poor, vulnerable Black, Puerto Rican, Latina, Native American, and disabled or mentally ill women who were secretly sterilized during other medical procedures. The eugenics movement was to breed a better race of people was a fantasy. So is the transsex movement. Comparing gender-affirming surgeries to the forcible sterilization of minorities and disabled people, essentially comparing us to genocide? How dare you? How dare you even bring such an upsetting and traumatic period of time into this? I don't care if you believe in trans people or not, which, by the way, believe, I'm right here, baby, I'm not a unicorn. I don't care if you believe in trans people or not. To compare the horrors of someone forcibly being sterilized, trying to wipe out our race of people, to people that voluntarily, I'm laughing because it's so absurd, to compare that to people that willingly go through years and years of gender therapy because they want to transition and finally feel like their complete selves when they get to where they want to be, is a reach, to say the least. She goes on to say that Biden's executive order on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation is basically tearing this country apart. So she writes, and again, I quote, she writes, "Sex no longer matters. If a man identifies as a woman, then he will be given access to formally protected women's single-sex spaces such as restrooms, locker rooms, women's prisons, and women/girls sports. The transsex fantasy has imagined and is enacting a world in which how a man feels is more real than his actual reality. And now the fantasy has the weight of the federal government behind it." Again, focusing exclusively on trans women, I want you to look at me. Look me in my eyes. No one is transitioning so that they can sit next to you in a closed stall and pee. No one is doing that. If someone is doing that, that is a mental health issue. That is not a trans issue. No one is going through years of therapy, their entire life of being treated like garbage, going through irreversible changes just to be in a stall next to you. I promise. Fact of the matter is that order was put into place to protect trans and queer people from being discriminated against in public spaces like schools or places of work. She is so focused on the idea of men invading women's spaces when, like, it's not only, like, I mean, clearly I'm not a man, but is she completely forgetting that trans men exist? That non-binary people exist? I don't think she even believes they exist anyway. So on the topic of free speech, she gets really, really upset about people losing their jobs over bigotry, which is sort of what should happen in this case, because we do not need old, archaic ways of thinking being taught and misinformation being fed to students that came here to get an education on gender and women's studies. I'm getting emotional because I'm thinking back to all of the times that I was in her class. I was the only transgender person in her classroom, and she knew it because I was visibly trans because I could give more to the discussion. And when she found out that I was transgender, she maybe called on me once, honey. Once. There had been multiple times where I was the only one with my hand up. And she would ask the class a question. It was only me with my hand up. She would see me and completely ignore me, to the point where other students even said, she has her hand up, and she just would go on to the next lesson. And I would be like, cool. So on the topic of free speech, she says, and I quote, "People are losing social media accounts or being fired for misgendering someone and not affirming a person's claimed gender identity. In the meantime, an increasing number of teens are signing up for harmful treatments with no one, not even parents, being allowed to intervene." That last part, I cannot even begin to explain how incorrect you are. Parents can't intervene on medical treatments. Since when? Since where? Please show me the receipts. Give me one time that has happened where a parent had no say on their child transitioning if they're a minor. Because I personally, because I transitioned so young, I went through all the steps. I had to convince my parents. I know several people that identified as trans at a young age. Their parents wouldn't allow them to even see a gender therapist, let alone have a procedure done. So this is sort of misinformation that needs to be stopped. Well, the transsex gender identity business is growing. According to a recent market analysis report, the sex reassignment surgery market was valued at $267 million in 2019, and given the 10 to 15% annual growth, is expected to earn $782 million in 2027. That's not a lot of money. My bottom surgery cost me $20,000, and that was one surgery. So anyway, again, quote, the report cites higher incidences of gender dysphoria and the increasing number of people choosing surgeries, end quote. As healthcare is becoming more readily available to trans people all across America, of course, more of us are going to be choosing to get our surgeries because it's available to us. Because for so many years prior, due to the discrimination on basis of sex, we have been pushed into poverty, homelessness, survival sex work, denied jobs, denied housing, all for the fact that we're just transgender. So if those numbers are rising, that's because we are not dying as often, or we are not being denied jobs and housing so we can actually afford and get healthcare. Because so many people go out of their way and write things like this, go out and spread hate and misinformation, trans people have had a target on our back. We have been at the bottom of the totem pole for decades. Just now, we are entering an era where we are receiving healthcare, we're receiving jobs, thanks to the women's rights movement in part to redefine what it means to be a woman. I am a woman. I identify as a woman. The women's rights movement and feminism as a whole made the world a safer place for trans people. She ends her article by writing, and I quote, "The US is still in crisis over the COVID-19 pandemic. After almost a year, people are wondering when they will get their vaccine and whether lockdowns and social distancing will ever end. However, the end of the global pandemic looks more likely to happen sooner than the fantasies ruining lives and political systems." Okay, so first off, let me address something. Yes, transgenderism is more widely known about. More people are going to wonder if they're transgender. Their journey might confuse them. They might go back, and that is absolutely okay. But to say that these people were pushed and forced into transition, to compare what they went through to the eugenics movement is absolutely next level and disrespectful to the people that went through the eugenics movement. I heard Laverne Cox say something to this effect on Variety's Hollywood Roundtable. Around 84% of Americans do not personally know someone who's transgender. That means about 84% of Americans are getting their information about trans people through not only the media, but through higher education and through professors. Right now, in this country and in countries all around the world, trans people, and especially trans women of color, have a target on our back. We are being beaten to death in the streets, lit on fire inside our cars, left for dead. Our unemployment rate is 3 times that of the national average and 4 times that for trans women of color. And so in this cultural environment where this rhetoric is being repeated by people that trans women are not really women or trans men are not really men anywhere, but especially by someone who is not only a professor, but an endowed chair of the Gender and Women's Studies department at a federally funded university. That is the basis of the discrimination that trans people experience. That is the justification that people point to when committing hate crimes against us. That we are somehow duplicitous, that we're not who we say we are, and that we have some sort of hidden malicious agenda, and that is absolutely and unequivocally untrue. So why am I sitting here making this video, reading this hateful article to you? I am doing this to put a face to the name of all of the queer students that Donna Hughes had made feel uncomfortable. I am calling on the Dean of Students at the University of Rhode Island, Jane Richmond, to not only remove Donna Hughes as the endowed chair of Gender and Women's Studies, but to also remove her as a professor. I have heard many stories, not only this article, this hurtful, bigoted article from someone that's supposed to be teaching us about gender. I have heard multiple stories of her allegedly refusing to use students' pronouns or refer to them at all. I recall one time we were discussing surrogacy and talking about, what if my sister wanted to carry a child for me and my partner, someone that couldn't. How did she feel about that? And she said, if you support that, you're not a feminist. And every single person in my class disagreed, but she said, you don't know what you're talking about. If a professor had written and published an anti-Semitic or anti-Black article, that professor would be removed immediately, as they absolutely should. But because it's a trans issue, somehow this is a matter of free speech. Hate is hate. Bigotry is bigotry, and discrimination is just that, discrimination. We cannot have this old, tired, false, backwards information being spread in a university. I myself, if I was to think about going to URI, being a trans person, I'm very interested in gender and sexuality, in women's studies. And the first thing I would do is I would look up the faculty, the people that I'm going to be under, especially the head chair of the department. I would see that name, Donna Hughes. I would do a quick little Google search and see that she is a trans exclusionary radical feminist. And I would not go to URI. If I was interested in GWS, I promise I would choose another school if Donna Hughes was continuing to teach there. If an agriculture professor was anti-farming, would you really keep them as the endowed chair, not just a professor, but the head chair of the department? I'm going to end this video by reading off of the academic advising page on URI, reading the biography of our current dean. As Dean of University College for Academic Success, I consider myself very lucky to work with a team of people whose job it is to make the University of Rhode Island a better place for student success. Our motto is, we welcome, we support, we challenge, we care, which we think says it all. If you welcome, if you support, if you challenge, if you care about each and every one of your students, we will work together to make this university a safer and more comfortable place, not only for trans people, but for students of all walks of life. It seems to me that there needs to be some sort of workshop, some sort of professional development and trans sensitivity training that needs to be done at the very least in the Gender and Women's Studies department, if not university-wide. So to the Dean of Students at URI, Jane Richmond, I am asking not only for the removal of Donna Hughes from the Gender and Women's Studies department, but also to work together to make URI a safer and better learning environment for students of all walks of life. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you want to help support the movement, please be sure to share this video. The more people that see it, the louder our voice is, and the more change will happen. Until I see you next Wednesday, good luck. I love you. Stay safe. Bye.